first American carrier to operate in the midwinter in the subarctic, first carrier launch of an airplane capable of delivering nuclear weapons, only ship to launch a captured German V-2 rocket, first successful landing using a hands-off autopilot technology.
The acronym MARINE stands for My Ass Rides in Navy Equipment. The day you stop investing in your military resources is the day you can ensure that your country is in jeopardy. From a battleship-centric Navy to an aircraft-centric Navy, which it remains today.
Admiral McLaughlin, welcome to the Jedburgh Podcast.
Thank you very much, Fran. Welcome to the Midway.
Well, thanks for hosting us. I got to tell you, this is one of the most impressive places I've ever been to in my life. Hands down.
It's quite a view, especially if you've never been on board one before. It's truly amazing.
I want to give a special shout out as we're set up here on the hangar deck with the aircraft. I want to give a special shout out to your team for working on setting this up, to Dave Kuntz, who was instrumental in getting us out here today. But I think it is important to preface this whole conversation that we're sitting on this aircraft carrier. And when you say that, I'm on an aircraft carrier, when you walk up to this ship, when you walk aboard on deck, you smile. And I start thinking to myself, why am I smiling? All morning, all weekend, I've been like, I'm smiling every time I tell anybody I'm going to the Midway, I'm going to the Midway, I'm going on an aircraft carrier. But you think about freedom, and you think about this idea of what America is, and the fact that America, at its heart, is the idea of freedom. And an aircraft carrier is the forward projection of freedom anywhere in the world. And how can you help but not smile when you come aboard this ship?
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about the founding of our country, I mean, we really never had a country until our freedoms were threatened. And at that point, those young colonists got together, the minority of inhabitants of America in those days, and said, you know what, we came here to build a country based on a government by the people, not run by the king. Our freedoms are being threatened by the king, and we're going to fight to maintain our freedoms. So it's really at the founding issue of this entire country, and we're just proud as can be to be able to display it here on the Midway.
Well, you mentioned history, and so I also want to thank you for sharing a very important aspect of Jedburgh Podcast history today, because this is going to be episode 100 of our long-form series. So two years ago, I embarked on this journey to tell these stories that have changed society, with leaders who've changed the world and are out there doing what I call lead from the front in all aspects of their life. And so I thought it was so fitting when the opportunity came up that this would be episode 100, commemorate the history of this ship, your career, your tenure here, and also celebrate 100 episodes long form of the Jedburgh Podcast.
Yeah, I think it's meant to be. You know, we just finished the centennial, the 100-year celebration of aircraft carriers in America last year, 2022. So to have you here for your 100th podcast is
it was meant to be
serendipity.
Let's start with the ship itself. So the ship itself, USS Midway, longest serving aircraft carrier of the 20th century, named after the Battle of Midway in June 1942, built in only 17 months, which you walk around and you think about how long it takes to build structures all around. People don't build houses sometimes in 17 months, and this is an aircraft carrier built in the 40s that way. It's the first of 3 ship class of large carriers that featured an armored flight deck, which I want to ask you about, and over 120 airplanes. What's different about this ship and this carrier itself than the ones that came before it?
You know, this carrier, for starters, was named after. You mentioned the time frame it was built in. Remember, we had a lot of very motivated men and women, and this ship was built primarily by women because most of the men of America were deployed and the women were working in the shipyards. The Midway was built by the women of America, and they were very motivated because it was 1942, 43. Pearl Harbor was in our rearview window, and we were trying to fight a war on 2 fronts. So that's that goes a little bit to the expeditious nature with which it was built. It was also built and named after the defining battle of World War II that really changed the course of history in the Pacific and represented the first time in the history of America that a battle was fought at sea and won by American forces that didn't involve battleships. Mm-hmm. It was the first time that two major fleets fought each other and never saw each other. The entire battle was done with airplanes. So in a way, the Midway represents the transformation of the United States Navy from a battleship-centric Navy to an aircraft-centric Navy, which it remains today. So it's historic in so many different ways. It really is.
Well, and the ship has went on to play these crucial roles in so many of the conflicts that throughout the 20th century that America was involved in. You think about the Cold War. It had in Vietnam, it was the lead aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf War. Can you talk about that history, that evolution after its commissioning, and now it goes into into service, and we enter these other conflicts?
Yeah, I really think one of the reasons why it ended up being the Midway that was the longest serving carrier in the 20th century, and why it survived World War II and went into Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, was actually the flagship as recent as Desert Storm, if you can imagine that. Spanned a long period of history. And I think the reason why the Navy did that, while other ships that were even younger than Midway were being decommissioned and sent off to scrap, is just the magic of this ship and the name Midway. This Battle of Midway, for which we were named after, is so historic for the country as well as for naval aviation. And the aircraft carrier became the first aircraft carrier that was forward deployed to a foreign country. All of our aircraft carriers are home ported here in the United States of America. The USS Midway was the first one and spent 19 years over in Yokosuka, Japan. When you're over in Yokosuka, Japan, the whole air wing goes with you. Mm-hmm. So the whole air wing is resident in Yokosuka, Japan. The whole engineering department, navigation department, the whole ship company is in Japan. So you really get a bonding and an ability to operate together far more effectively than your average aircraft carrier that takes a squadron from Norfolk, one from Whidbey, some come in from San Diego. You ship in a lot of people and they deploy with a trained crew once they're worked up. This Midway crew for 19 years over in Yokosuka lived, trained, drank beer together, families had picnics together, and it became the most operationally effective aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific, despite the fact it was so old. And that's because of the people that were bonded at the hip that operated this carrier for all those years.
Well, and I have to imagine. So obviously I was in the Army, so I don't know much about living on a ship. But you really do. It does become a community. You really do get close when you operate in these quarters. I mean, this is a massive ship, but the majority of this ship is the hangar, the flight deck, and the quarters where everyone's actually kind of living and stuff. Can you talk a bit about what it's like to actually live on the ship?
Yeah, you kind of get to know everybody in this small city at sea. You might not know their names, but you know what they look like. You bump into them on a daily basis, and it really does become a family. And the more effective the family can work together, the more effective the operational capability of the ship is. And that's why the Midway was so effective. It really was a family affair over there in Yokosuka.
So we're big on firsts on the podcast. This ship has had a lot of firsts. You just mentioned a couple of them. I'll list some here, and you can add to it, or we can talk about them. But first American carrier to operate in the midwinter in the subarctic. Only ship to launch a captured German V-2 rocket, which was the dawn of naval missile warfare. First successful landing using a hands-off autopilot technology. First carrier launch of an airplane capable of delivering nuclear weapons. First air kill of the Vietnam War. First American carrier home ported abroad, as you mentioned, in Japan. And we talked about Operation Desert Storm, where not a first, but it was the lead carrier in the Persian Gulf War, launching over 3,000 combat missions with no losses. Why are these firsts so important, not only to the Midway, but to America?
I think you're right. I don't think that it's so much first about the Midway, and we've never wanted the story when people come on board here to be about the Midway. We want it to be about America. So all those firsts are emblematic of so many other firsts of so many other ships, so many Army units, Marine Corps units. It's really just a delivery of an idea and a vision and a reality that most Americans are not aware of. So when they come on this ship, they come because they're curious. They've never been on an aircraft carrier. But once they get on board, it becomes more a story of the young men and women that serve on this aircraft carrier and in other areas of the world that protect the freedoms that our visitors are probably taking for granted. And by the time they leave the ship, we really hope that they understand that the service and sacrifice of these young Americans is so important for the long-term future of America.
Well, let's talk about your service. 1972 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Why enter the Navy?
Well, I entered the Navy because my dad was a sailor, and it's what I always wanted to do. And I was scheduled to go to the University of Notre Dame on a full scholarship, and I got accepted at the Naval Academy. And
not a bad choice between those two schools.
Yeah, I always loved the Fighting Irish, and but I wanted to be a naval officer. Don't ask me why. I just grew up the son of a sailor, and that's what I wanted to be. And graduated, came out here to San Diego, got to spend a marvelous career in naval aviation, flying helicopters, and then when I retired, just serendipity once again. Came out here to San Diego just about the time they were looking for somebody to bring the Midway to San Diego and open it up as a museum. I raised my hand. Nobody else did, so I got selected.
Sometimes being the only guy makes you the best guy.
Exactly.
I want to ask you about helicopters, though, in the Navy, because you did spend the preponderance of your career as a naval aviator. When we think about naval aviation, we think about Tom Cruise and Maverick and Goose and Top Gun and we look at the planes here in this hangar, but almost 50% of the pilots in the Navy are fly helicopters and rotary wing aircraft. Why is rotary wing aircraft so important to the Navy?
Well, I think rotary aircraft, if you look at the history of naval aviation, was late to the story. I mean, helicopters weren't invented and developed until the late 50s. We've been flying airplanes off ships for decades. So it came in as an interesting curiosity that was basically there to rescue downed aircraft pilots when they punched out or had to ditch at sea, search and rescue missions. But over time, as the mission of the Navy has become so much more equipment-centric, there's been so much capability that have been put into our jet aircraft flying off here, the props, and the helicopters, that the helicopters are becoming more and more a factor in the operations of the Navy. I mean, on an aircraft carrier, when I was operating, there'd be one squadron. These days, no carrier deploys without two helicopter squadrons there, and they deploy out to the smaller ships in the task group from there. So it's really grown from a interesting sidelight curiosity that's built there to support the tactical aviators and their safety into a totally integrated mission now, with the jets, the props, and the helicopters all working together as one force, doing different various issues of the mission to prosecute the enemy.
And one of the specialties that you had as a pilot was what they called the LAMPS Squadron, or the Light Airborne Multi-Purpose System. I had the opportunity to have General Clay Hutmacher on, and he was the commander of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, so that all the helicopters that fly Special Operations Forces all over the world. And we talked a lot about the different capabilities that various different platforms bring. But you were one of the first ones in these units. Can you talk about the capability of that unit and how it changed so much of what we were doing?
Yeah, it's the LAMP squadrons were the ones that flew off the back ends of the smaller ships that support the carrier group. So, as we talked about earlier, the carrier is the mother lode. Everything is built around protecting that carrier, because without the carrier and without the tactical aircraft that fly off the carrier, you lose the heart and the envelope of your entire mission. So I would fly the smaller helicopters out there on the frigates, out on the destroyers, out there in the screen, protecting the carrier. And we would do anti-submarine warfare, anti-ship warfare, to make sure that nobody snuck up from beneath or on the surface, got anywhere near our carrier, which is the main target for the enemy, needless to say.
Yeah. So I'm a strong advocate of studying history, because I think we can only experience so many things in our life, but if we study history, it kind of augments a lot of our learning and helps us to forge better decisions. The greatest civilizations in the world all had powerful navies. You think about the Greeks, the British, the Japanese, the Scandinavians, back to before probably the word navy, there was a word navy, and certainly the American Navy since the World War era. I had the chance on Friday to sit down with the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, sitting Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, Troy Black, and we talked about how important the Navy is to the Marines and how they're the enabler of so much of what the Marines do. And then you think about something like the Persian Gulf War, you think about all these different conflicts that we talked about a few minutes ago and how critical the Navy was. You led a major component of America's naval forces as the commander of the Naval Reserve Forces. You also commanded a naval air station in New Orleans. Can you talk about the Navy in general and why it is so important to our national defense and the strategic defense initiatives of America?
Well, I think if you look back at history and you understand the beginnings of this country, it was mostly inside the continent and expanding out to the west and building the state structure that we have today. But in the 20th century, things started happening on a international scale. And once that started happening, really it began in the 19th century, the history of sea power in this nation. And once you understand we truly are an island nation, if you go out to the moon and take a snapshot of America, it's all water all around us all the time. So if you're going to project power, if you're going to defend other nations that are in power, you can't do it with just an Army, with just a Marine Corps, or even just an Air Force. You need naval structure, like you said, to deploy those Marine forces, to bring the Army Special Forces into where they need to be, which oftentimes is along the coast. And by the way, you mentioned the Navy deploying with the Marines. You have to remember the word Marine itself, the acronym MARINE, stands for My Ass Rides in Navy Equipment. So it goes without saying that in addition to the raw power that our Navy projects with its cruise missiles, with its tactical aircraft, with its ballistic missile submarines, the whole spectrum of our warfare, it's also taking the people who have to go inland, ground forces, special operation forces, and deploying them and getting them to where they need to go. So as long as America has the responsibility of maintaining its supremacy as an international power, we will need to continue investing in a very strong Navy.
America has been fortunate over the last 20 plus years of declared conflict where we have not faced an adversary who has had a naval force. We're entering now what we are openly referring to as the peer-to-peer competition. We think about China and their capabilities, Russia and their capabilities, although less so to what we face, I think, with China. They have very, very capable naval forces. And so the idea that has always sat in the back of our head that we have supremacy and that supremacy is assumed, whether we talk about air capability or we talk about naval capability or talk about information capability, we're now putting it in our minds, at the front of our minds, that we can no longer operate under that assumption. When you think about the future, you think about the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years, how will the Navy continue and need to continue to remain a critical focal point of our national defense strategy?
Well, I think it all starts with our people, the quality of the young people that we bring in. That is the base. But I will share with you, you mentioned the Soviets, and if you look at the evolution of their Navy, ultimately when you get into a superpower v superpower confrontation of forces, the battle is really decided by who resources their forces the best, who invests the most in their people, who invests the most in their equipment. And the truth is that the Soviet Union could not stay up with America technologically. They are no longer a threat at sea. Yes, they certainly have a nuclear capability, and that's enough to scare anybody. But as far as their forces that at one time were reaching parity with the American forces, we out-resourced them. Mm-hmm. We invested more. We invented more. And we grew stronger, and they quit. Mm-hmm. And they became the weak sea power that they are today. I think the conversation's underway, and what the future will hold will depend on what America decides to invest in the power of their forces. So many people who are unknowing think that, oh my gosh, if we need to stop investing in the military so we can have peace. And exactly the opposite is true. Mm-hmm. The day you stop investing in your military resources is the day you can ensure that your country is in jeopardy. It's a sad thing to say that, but the reality of history bears it out. Yeah. And as long as America maintains its investment, its armed forces, not just the Navy, but all of the services, we will maintain our supremacy, and other countries will not want to challenge us. And there may be discourse and intellectual debate and conversation about that issue, but in reality, nobody will challenge us.
Yeah. I mean, you tie that back even to conversation about this ship and aircraft carriers and our strategic objectives, and what's the first thing we do as a country when we face crisis, when we face threat. We deploy Air Force bombers, and we move a carrier group.
Yes, we do, and we've always invested. You can even go back to Pearl Harbor, where most of our investment was going into our battleship force, and thank God 2 decades before we started this new experiment of investing in aircraft carriers. Can you imagine where America would have been in the Western Pacific if we had a battleship-centric Navy and had no aircraft carriers and Pearl Harbor occurred? We would have been right where Japan wanted us at that point, on our knees, totally defensive, without any capability to do anything about the world order.
Let's talk about the museum.
My favorite subject.
the only CEO of the museum. April 11th, 1992, the Midway's decommissioned in San Diego, went up into storage until 2003, and then it was brought down here to the San Diego Aircraft Carrier Museum organization, and it was directed that there was an opportunity to create the USS Midway Museum, which opened in 2004. You came in kind of in that window, as you said, when they were looking for someone to lead this initiative. What was the opportunity that you saw here, and what made you, as you transitioned out of the Navy, to say, I got to go do that? And here we go. We got it's a live environment. So what's going on behind us?
That's the every half hour we have to sound the bells and make the 1MC announcement so all the sailors know what's going on the ship. That's exactly what you just heard. But, when I go back to retiring in August of 2003, and I got hired for this in December of 2003, and the ship got here the very next month in January of 2004, I was essentially clueless. And if I would have been aware of the daunting challenges ahead, I probably would have never signed up for the job. That's why the competition wasn't too keen for the job.
I don't believe you.
No,
I
it's
think
true.
You still would have done it.
That is a fact. The people who had been here in San Diego had watched the 10 years of turmoil to get the ship here. I was on active duty while all that was going on, totally clueless. Showed up. They asked me if I'd like to interview, and me, amongst 2 or 3 other people interviewed, and I was fortunate enough to get the job. I am in the process of retiring now at the end of March, and when we announced the job here 20 years later, because of the success of the museum, we had over 500 national applicants. And it was all I will say is, if I had to compete against the group that we're competing right now, I wouldn't be sitting here interviewing with you. That's all I can say.
What was your vision when you got into the job? You realized what it was. I mean, a lot of it was probably a bit of a blank canvas to figure out what to do with it.
It was very much a blank canvas when we started. We had nothing. If you see anything on this ship, it wasn't here when we started. We had no electricity. We had no water. We had no exhibits. We had 4 airplanes. We didn't even have a way to get on and off the ship. We borrowed a brow from the Navy, and we started slowly. And, oh, by the way, we were $8 million in debt. We had no sources of revenue. We had no staff. But other than that, things were looking up.
It was a good day.
You know, kind of like the colonists when they look across the water at the strongest Navy and the strongest Army in the history of the world, and they don't have an Army or a Navy, and they say, let's give it a try. That kind of was my attitude. But I remember my marketing manager and me standing on the pier on the very first day looking up at this giant gray ship that was now in our little pristine port saying, what the hell are we going to do now? And our vision was that we could not build this as an icon to my career and the career of many of my buddies and my friends into a Navy, fort, a Navy icon that would appeal to Navy and Marine Corps people, but the rest of the public would not get it. We've really focused on building this into something that the average family with no military background or experience will come aboard and have an enjoyable visit, in addition to the purest veterans. We can't insult the people that this carrier was built for, but we have to acknowledge that when that veteran is driving back to Los Angeles with his wife and 2 kids, the people that decide whether or not they had fun on the Midway are not driving that car.
Right. Yep.
It's the family that has no military experience. So we tried to create a balanced museum that was very modern and yet still displayed the traditional, iconic, and authentic views of what it must have been like to be on an aircraft carrier, while at the same time entertaining our guests and allowing them to have a fun visit. Not just look at planks and touch airplanes. And we've done that in large part with our volunteers. Our volunteers are the key to our success. Most of them are retired military. Many of them are not. But they've come to the Midway, and they tell the personal story, so that when people come on board the ship, it's not just about the ship and the airplanes. It's about the human interest stories. It's about imagining what these kids go through, gone from home 7 months a year, sitting on an old rickety aircraft carrier, launching and recovering jets 24/7. It's about letting them appreciate what has always been essential for the greatness of our country, and that's the service and sacrifice of our veterans.
I want to ask about some of the exhibits, because you started laying some out here and how they are appealing to so many different groups of folks. But you've got the hangar deck, the flight deck, below deck, the aircraft gallery. Can you talk for a minute about each one of these and why they're unique to this ship?
Sure. If you open up an aircraft carrier and you just were opening it up for just pilots, you'd open up the flight deck, you'd put the planes up there, and all the pilots were standing around in their flight jackets looking cool with their sunglasses, asking our guests, what else do you need, man? This is what it's all about. Okay? But we're not developing a museum just for pilots. So you open up the other parts of the museum. You mentioned the decks below the hangar deck. That's the city at sea down there. That's telling the story. Well, okay, I get it. You fly jets off. You see those all the time on CNN. But who does the laundry? So we let them see the laundry. Where do they do before we had the information system, how do these kids get paid? Where do they eat? We show them where they eat. Where do they work? Where do they sleep? We let the guests get in their bunks and see what it feels like to have 3 bunks on top of 3 bunks on top of 3 bunks. Try to imagine yourself out there for months on end like that. So the city at sea, in addition to the straight tactical operational environment, is very interesting to people. And one of the things that we do, we call ourselves the partying ship in the Navy. We definitely have a drinking problem after hours because groups come on board the ship all the time to the tune of about $275 a year after hours.
That's almost
rent
every day.
the ship, have their cocktail parties, and use it instead of going to a hotel ballroom. And we do everything from little bar mitzvah parties for 100 to celebrations for 3,000 people up on the flight deck and everything in between. So it's become a real special events venue. This hangar deck that you mentioned is supposed to be filled with airplanes, but we can't do that because we have so many special events that we set up for down there. So you're getting a feel of the balance that's required in a successful aircraft carrier museum, which the Midway is the most successful aircraft carrier museum because of our location here in San Diego at Navy Pier in the middle of a 12-month-a-year destination area here in San Diego that it's become.
And you can go up on the flight deck and look across the bay and see active aircraft carriers.
Right, and you can see them coming in and out of the bay, and the other ships, and the airplanes, and you can look across the bay at the field where aircraft aviation was invented, and the Navy's first naval air station over there, and where the first naval aviator was trained, and frankly, where the first Navy's 4 aircraft carriers back when we first started in the 1920s were birthed here in San Diego. This was America's aircraft carrier home port, and today you can look across the bay and see the big tower where the commander of all the aircraft carriers across the world still resides. They're all commanded here out of San Diego. So San Diego's kind of an aircraft carrier-centric town. It's the place where it all began. It's the place where it continues to be commanded and led by, and we just happen to be the lucky carrier that represents all that here on the pier.
I want to ask about the foundation. So the USS Midway Foundation was established in 2016. And the mission of the foundation is to help fund education programs, organizations, and initiatives that support America's core values of service and sacrifice in the name of freedom. So can you talk about the importance of the foundation and the work that they're doing with youth and teacher programs?
Sure can. The museum is the museum, and we focus on what happens when you get here until when you leave. The foundation is the long-term, future-looking visionary group that, frankly, we've been forced to expand because of our success. So if it occurs off the ship, whether it's an education program that want to come on the ship or an education program off the ship, the building of our Veterans Park, Freedom Park, that's going to surround the USS Midway. It's going to be the largest veterans park on the west coast of America. The foundation is leading that effort. And the foundation gives away millions of dollars a year to other not-for-profits that service veterans and first responders group. That's unprecedented for a not-for-profit organization like the USS Midway Museum through its foundation to give millions a year to other not-for-profit foundations.
And normally to keep it for yourself.
No, that's not our job to keep it for ourselves. Our job is to keep America strong and propagate that message throughout the civilian population.
Wow. What about the pillars of freedom? I did want to talk about that because that was specific to veterans and active duty first responders. How's that playing?
It is. The Pillars of Freedom is an annual grant program where we give, this past year we gave close to $700,000. It'll be going up over $1 million in future years to other not-for-profit organizations. That is our grant giving opportunity. Through the foundation, they grant annually, invite organizations on board. We have a big breakfast meeting. The mayor comes in and we give free money with no strings attached to organizations that are really doing the deck plate work with the soldiers and the sailors and the Marines and the soldiers and the kids that are really doing the job out there. Any financial assistance that we can give to them, we're going to do.
So you mentioned that you've got a little over a month left before retirement. When you look back on your 20 years here, and you think about how far this museum has come, the foundation has come, and now you also have one of the legacies that you're working on is the endowment, to leave an endowment here so that it can self-fund itself moving forward. What's the biggest success? How do you look back on this 20-year journey?
I think the biggest success is the fact that we have established this as a real community asset that is opened up this waterfront down here in San Diego to an unprecedented level. This area of San Diego, when I was in the Navy here, was not visited by the general public. This was Navy land. This was where the sailors came to get their tattoos, maybe stop off at a bar. Nobody certainly came down here after hours. And since the Midways got here, this whole area has developed. This whole area is now the most visited pedestrian area on the whole San Diego Bay. And it's just going to get better and better as we move to the future. So I think with the arrival of Midway, I joke about since the Midway has started protecting San Diego Bay, we've really started to blossom in this area. And I think we're going to create an area that in future generations, they're going to be able to come to the Veterans Park, they're going to come to the Midway, and they're going to get to experience the founding story of our nation.
What's next in retirement?
A lot of golf, a little bit more relaxation, zero responsibility other than to my children and my wife and my golf game. I'm going to start off real simple, and we'll see what happens after that.
It'll be an exciting next chapter.
Yes, I think so.
And having impacted a tremendous amount of people, both through your Navy career and what you've done here over the last 20 years at the museum.
Thanks.
As we close out, the Jedburghs in World War II had to do three things every day as core foundations, habits, if you will. They had to be able to shoot, move, and communicate. If they did these three things with the utmost precision, then they could focus their attention and their efforts on more complex challenges that came their way. What are the three things that you do every day in your life to set the conditions for success?
I'm a simple guy, and simplicity, I think, is the key to my success, whatever success that has been. But I've actually always had four principles that I think if you're in America and you follow these four precepts, you're going to do fine as an American. Number one is show up. And I mean show up. I mean, you don't just muster, but you show up. And number two is you pay attention once you show up. You listen. You watch who's successful. You watch who's not successful. Figure out what the right answer is. And the third one, just work hard. And when I say work hard, work harder than everybody around you. And the last one is you do those first three, never give up. And you keep going back to those four principles, and I don't care what aspect of life you're in here in America, you will have a successful life in America.
That's command philosophy.
Nice and simple.
Nice and simple. That's it. Show up, pay attention, work hard, never give up.
Yep.
And as I look around here and I look at all the people who are walking by and they're stopping and watching here for a few minutes and just how impressive it is so easy to look at all this and say, this is exactly what you've done here since the first day when you came in and had that first interview, and it manifests itself here absolutely every minute of every day.
It's been the joy of my life, believe me. I'm a lucky man.
Well, sir, thank you. Thank you for welcoming us onto this ship. Thank you for sharing the 100th episode of the Jedburgh Podcast with you in this absolutely amazing space. I think we're going to take a tour. I'm going to go look around and see some stuff. You can show me your favorite spots.
You'll love it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor Jersey Mike Subs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As a former member of Special Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast donates a percentage of all proceeds to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.